the notice now and making sure that the captions are showing for everyone. Okay. So a few things I want to talk about. I've been going through everybody's comments on Perusal. I still have to double check the grades and make sure everything's transferring to Canvas correctly. So give me like one more day to get that done. But if you spot issues, also let me know, and I can usually correct those ASAP. But one of the things I'm noticing is that the comments you are making on the Hinojosa reading are really great. So if you've been doing the reading, if you've been looking at the prompt for the final paper and you're wondering what the hell you're going to write your paper on, read everybody's comments on Perusal. You should be able to see most people's comments as they make as people add them. And there's a few themes that I've already been noticing, and these are some of the themes that I'm going to talk about with you all in class, so we can have the discussion about these themes. But one of the themes that I see you all pointing out is how her personal life connects with some of the political elements, right? In part because she's a journalist, so of course she's following politics, she's covering them, but how her personal life connects to larger social political issues, that can be the theme or the main focus for your final paper. Another thing I noticed, a lot of you are picking up on elements of resilience, particularly from immigrant communities. Right. So that is a theme. That is a theme that is specific to the way she's telling the story. One, because she's focusing on immigrants, right? A lot of her story focuses on immigration policies and its effects. So the theme of resilience can be the main focus of your paper for that final paper. The other big thing I was noticing in the readings for specifically for last week was like she's going through the presidential elections and through the precedents. In last week's reading, she specifically talked about Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, right? And that the way she talks about those two precedents is unique in the way most people talk about them. Even in the context of history classes, a lot of times we talk about the precedents in terms of their elections, what politics shifted, what didn't, whatever scandals they might have had with Clinton. A lot of it is dominated by the impeachment trials and the Monica Lewinsky scandals. So that is usually the way Clinton is depicted. The way Hinojosa talks about Bill Clinton is not in that context, right? She's talking about his approach to immigration, to border control, to all of these topics. And so it gives you a different view of these precedents. Right. So you can talk about that. You can talk about how when looking through the lens of immigration and border security, how the story is very different when she focuses it through the immigration point of view. Right. If that's what interests you, if those are the things you are finding yourself commenting on, then that should be your theme for the final paper. But again, your final paper is not due yet. That is instead of a final exam. So we will not have a final exam next week. Instead of a final exam, you're submitting that final paper, right? So just a note here that next week, that's all you have. You don't have any readings next week. You don't have, or any additional readings. You don't have a Canvas assignment or a source analysis to write. You just have that final paper, and it's going to be due April 11th. So I believe I scheduled it. Let me look at my calendar once again, so I'm not giving you false information. April 11th is next Friday. So normally I like to, all of the assignments in here have been due Sunday, but because I have to get grades in, right? My grades are due to the registrar Wednesday, August 16th. I want to make sure that I have that full weekend to grade everybody's paper. So instead, your papers are going to be due on Friday by midnight. Next Friday by midnight. So that means that next week, all I want you doing is really working on that paper, right? So what we're going to do is on Tuesday, we're going to discuss it. I'm going to talk about what your thesis statement should look like, what kind of analysis I'm expecting, what kind of citation, how your citation should look. and recommendations for the kind of things that go into an introduction and in a conclusion. So I will talk about the mechanics of writing on Tuesday with everybody in class. And then on Thursday, instead of holding a class, what I'm going to do that is make the whole class period optional, where I will be on Zoom our entire class period next Thursday. You're not required to be here, but anybody that wants to show me a draft, if you want to show me your thesis statement, if you need help understanding the prompt, anything, I will be in class for the entire class period. So I'll be here from 2:45 to 4:38 to answer any questions and to help you with any aspect of your paper that you might need. Right, so plan that in. It's the day before it's due, so it's a good time to come in with a draft, even if it's an unfinished draft. Right, even if it's an unfinished draft. You can use the life happens clause on the final paper. There's enough wiggle room for me here that I can say that if you need a little bit of extra time, I can give some. I can give you that, but better be done, right? The better papers are always the done papers, so that you all can move on. So once again, I'll repeat that. So next week on Tuesday, we will meet. We'll talk about the final paper, and then on Thursday, I will hold class as a kind of office hour. So it's completely optional, but I'm going to try to encourage as many of you to come in and at least show me your thesis statement, so that you know you're on the right track. What questions do you have about next week? No questions? Okay, then let's finish up this week. This week we want to finish up. You still have those 2 readings and 1 analysis response on Canvas. So I'm going to try to help you out with especially the Dobbs decision response by talking about the history of abortion today. Before we get there, I want to finish this discussion about eugenics because it is often left out of discussions about reproductive rights. Right, I've been, as somebody who studies this history, I've been looking at what a lot of organizations that call themselves reproductive rights organizations, the kind of messaging that they're doing, the kind of resources they're providing for people. And I'm still seeing a lot of these organizations that don't focus on a wider aspect of reproductive rights, right? Which includes the right of people to have children if they want to, right? And one of the key elements when thinking about how people are prevented from having children when they have to is through forced sterilizations. Right. So people having tubal ligations, or what's more commonly known as getting your tubes tied without having been given consent, without even knowing that it's happening a lot of times. Right. There's a long history of that happening that we can trace back to the eugenics movement in the 1920s. And since then has occurred way too often in public hospitals in the United States. Right, hospitals, especially that cater to low-income communities. One of the most notorious cases was the case in Los Angeles at the LA County Hospital, which we talked about. And they did sue. So this is an image of the lawyer that helped several women sue the LA County Hospital over these sterilizations that were conducted without affirmative consent. They were not successful in suing the hospital or the doctors involved. The courts ruled in favor of the hospital and the doctors, in large part because the doctors had gotten written consent forms, right? They'd gotten signatures on those consent forms. The problem with those consent forms were that they were in English, and a lot of the women that signed those consent forms did not read in English. Nobody translated those forms for them, and nobody told them often what was even in those forms. So those that is not affirmative consent, right? And usually for these kinds of medications, what the ethics boards for doctors, for anybody in the medical field, is that you have to attain affirmative consent. And affirmative consent means the person who is consenting, knowing, having all the information they need to actually give consent, right? That ethical bar was not met here. The court said that the legal bar was met, but the ethical bar was definitely not met. Now, in California, Governor Gray Davis, oh my goodness, why am I thinking of the previous governors? Our current governor signed a reparations bill in which anyone who was sterilized without their consent in California has to fill out paperwork, and they could get money. They can get monetary compensation from the state for the sterilization that occurred without their consent. Now, the deadline is coming up. I believe it's next month. So if you know of anybody that experienced these forced sterilizations, please, if you don't have the information, let me know, and I can get the information posted on Canvas for everybody, because in the past when I've talked about this, I've had students tell me I've had a student tell me their mother was affected by these forced sterilizations. The people in our communities had this happen to them, and it's because people are ashamed of what was done to them. Oftentimes we might not even know, or they might not know that the state is offering reparations for this. So although there was nobody held legally responsible for it, the state of California has apologized, acknowledged that this was done, and is offering some monetary compensation. But Latinas in California were not the only group affected, right? I had said on Tuesday that Indigenous communities were impacted as well. We know that in the 1970s, somewhere between 25 to 42% of Indigenous women that went to a public hospital were sterilized, usually through a tubal ligation, by getting their tubes tied. Now, this is a huge range. Somewhere between 25 to 42% of women, of Indigenous women that attended these hospitals were sterilized. Part of it is we don't know the exact numbers because people don't speak up, right? People a lot of times didn't know that this happened to them. When they realize that happened to them, they are too afraid of saying anything. Right? Why do you think people are afraid of speaking out when they realize that they were sterilized without their consent? Why would people be too afraid of speaking up? Any thoughts? So there's several factors. Possible repercussions. Yeah, they're afraid of being targeted, right? Some of it is shame, right? Shame and not knowing what happened to them. Yeah, Brenda, shame within the families and communities, right? In some communities, part of being a woman, part of womanhood is being able to have children. Having families, in some cases, having large families is something that is valuable. Minimum at being able to have children is valuable. And there's stigma about not being able to. So a lot of times the people that experience these forced sterilizations don't want to speak up, even within their families and their own communities. It just doesn't always happen, right? Some of the women that were sterilized in Los Angeles, for example, talked about how their marriages ended after they told their husbands that they couldn't have children. Why? Because the husbands had this idea that only women who are cheaters, only women who are having sex with multiple men need to have a sterilization. And it didn't matter that this was done without their consent, that they didn't even know it was happening. Once family members, husbands found out about it, the relationship was deteriorated. So it had a real emotional effect on people. Right. So there's lots of reasons why people don't come forward about this. So it's hard to know how many Indigenous women in particular were sterilized without their consent. In LA, we have a lot of the information in part because lawyers went in looking at the medical records and went out to try to find these people. Like the lawyer was knocking on doors saying, hey, we have this document saying you were sterilized at the LA County Hospital. Did you know this was happening to you? Like, did you know? And by doing that, by knocking on people's door, we were able to get a better sense of how many people this was done to. But in communities where that has not been done, then all we have is a kind of range, right? A kind of range for it. So again, we know that this was done oftentimes without consent and without people knowing. And for Indigenous communities is a part of this larger policy from the American government of trying to eliminate Indigenous communities, right? A kind of genocide that was enacted on Indigenous communities because it's happening at the same time that that reservations were being made smaller and smaller, because it hasn't been enough that like a lot of Indigenous communities was forced into these reservations. But when the reservations were created, a kind of treaty was signed with the American government that, okay, you're agreeing to be on this reservation, but in exchange, the government has certain responsibilities, one, providing healthcare, but also of respecting autonomy within the reservation. Well, what has happened in several cases is that the reservation ends up being on land that is either profitable or wanted for some reason. There might be oil in there. It might be in the pathway of creating some sort of road or something that is beneficial for the American government. And oftentimes what happens when there is a conflict between the American government and an Indigenous community on a reservation is the American government tends to win out. And as a result, even the territory that it was originally given to these Indigenous communities in the form of reservations has shrunk. Yeah, shrunk. So when you do that, at the same time that you're sterilizing people without their consent, that you are trying to assimilate them into their general population, that is a form of genocide, right? Of trying to make these Indigenous communities disappear. And then something that is getting a lot more attention in the last 5 years is maternal death rates, right? The US stands out as having one of the worst maternal health rates, especially for an industrialized developed nation. Right? When you compare the US maternity, the rates of women dying giving birth, people dying giving birth, our death rates stand out. They are much higher than they are, for example, anywhere in Western Europe. And the question is, why? Why in a country where we're supposed to have access to some of the best healthcare in the world, where we're supposed to have access to clean water and food, right? Why are so many people dying at childbirth? Well, we have some of the information as to what is happening, right? One, this is not just a small discrepancy, right? In the course of the 21st century, that the rate of people dying at childbirth in the US has been really high in comparison to other countries in similar economic situations, right? Like this is the blue line is comparison to other countries, other developed countries, and the black line is the death rate in the United States. It's significantly higher. Well, when you break down the information on who's dying, right? Who's dying at childbirth? What you see is very clear. right? When you break down the data by race and ethnicity, Black women, this orange line over here is the mortality rate of Black women. Black women are more likely to die at childbirth than any other racial or ethnic group. 4 times, Black women are 4 times more likely to die at childbirth than any other racial or ethnic group. So again, the questions, like the data is telling us there is a huge discrepancy here, right? A huge gap. It is clear Black women are most affected by this. But the data doesn't necessarily answer the question of why. This data. We've done other investigations of, for example, what the death rate of infants, how likely are babies just born, are they to die? And what we find is that Black babies are more likely to survive childbirth and the initial aftermath of childbirth when they have Black doctors in the room or Black nurses. When there's a Black doctor in the room or a Black nurse in the room during a delivery, Black babies are more likely to survive and be healthy. What does that tell us in this? If we're talking about maternal and infant mortality rates, what does that information tell us? What's the analysis? If Black babies are more likely to survive and be healthy when there is a Black doctor or a Black nurse in the room. What conclusion?
Non-Black doctors are much less careful about the childbirth procedure.
Yes, right? Because if there's, it means there's some racism happening here, right? Yes, Sammy says Black babies are at risk when there is not a Black doctor or a Black nurse in the room. Yes. And what we find is that this matches up with the stories that Black women tell of giving birth, right? What a lot of Black women are saying is that when they complain about pain that's not normal, abnormal pain during childbirth, that oftentimes nurses and doctors ignore their complaints. They don't listen to them. And as a result, then they experience more complications during childbirth and delivery. Right? And this goes back to one of the points about this doctors believing that Black people can endure more pain than others, right? Because why? Why would doctors and nurses be ignoring when Black women complain about pain? And it seems to be that it's because they are trained to believe that Black people, in this case, Black women, oftentimes, that they can handle more pain. Therefore, if a Black woman is telling them, I am in pain and this is not normal childbirth pain, they oftentimes ignore it. And it kind of doesn't make sense. Like when you're thinking about it in a logical sense, even if you do believe, like, okay, if you believed that Black people can handle more pain, but this Black patient is telling you, I am in abnormal amount of pain, that would seem to, like, to me logically, I would think like, then that means this pain is actually worse. But no, it's just the racist attitudes, not just of the doctors and the nurses are in the room, but of a system, because that's how they were trained, right? These doctors and nurses are oftentimes following their training. And so it's not just necessarily the fault of a handful of like racist doctors and nurses, right? It's not just about racist doctors and nurses, although that is a factor, but it's also about institutionalized racism. Yeah, like it's the system teaching people these racist ideas about pain management, right? And what to expect in treating patients. Yeah, Christian, like the whole system. Yeah, this is why people talk about systemic racism. That because when we make it all about, oh, racist people are the ones to blame, we eliminate the way in which the whole system was designed to function in this way. Right? That a lot of these fields, these medical fields, developed when there was a lot of racism, and those racist attitudes then got embedded into the system. Right? So if we want to combat the issue, right? If we want to combat the issue, if you care about these things, then it's not just about like eliminating the racist people, getting them out of these jobs. No, it's examining the whole system, right? This is still, by the way, in the most recent studies, this particular graph that I had that I put here only goes to 2005. The most recent studies done show that this is still happening. The mortality rates for Black women in the US are still disproportionately 4 times more likely. Black women are still 4 times more likely to die giving birth than any other racial or ethnic group. So it's hasn't been addressed. It's still a problem. April says, but don't doctors learn about how humanity is like human and it shouldn't feel and could feel pain? Yes. So this is the problem, right? That, scientifically speaking, right? We're all human. We have much more in common biologically than not. It turns out that racial and ethnic factors, when it comes to biology, are not that determinant, right? But a lot of medical schools, a lot of medical textbooks are still teaching these racist ideas. So some of these doctors are not learning that. Yeah, they're not learning that. Right? They're learning from textbooks and from other doctors in medical schools, right? From their professors, very racist approaches to medicine. Yeah. And I said that this is still happening, right? So the maternity rates are one of the evidences we have of how these kinds of problems still exist when looking at issues of reproductive rights. Another big example to me is what's happening in ICE detention centers and in prisons. Right? In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a lawyer and inmates started talking about the way in which women in prison were being treated. Right. Sometimes if you pay attention to these issues, it'll come up in like a lot of women that are incarcerated. If they're pregnant and they give birth in prison, they will be taken to the hospital and they'll be handcuffed. They'll still be handcuffed to the bed or to something. And that this is, for activists, this is really inhumane way of treating people who are giving birth. Like even if they're prisoners, that they don't need to be shackled when they're giving birth. But the other thing is in California prisons in the 90s and early 2000s, there were doctors that were sterilizing women in prison without their consent. Women in prison were sometimes complaining of medical issues, sometimes bladder problems, other medical issues, sometimes it was broken bones, other health issues. So they would see a prison doctor. And oftentimes what was happening was a sterilization. A tubal ligation would occur. And if you ask these doctors, because these in California, they were caught. These doctors were caught because inmates started speaking out, and they managed to find a lawyer that was willing to help them. So they sued the state of California over these forced sterilizations because they were illegal. There is a federal law that says that you cannot sterilize someone who is in prison. You cannot, you cannot sterilize someone in prison. Why? Because they can't give consent. Right? When someone is in a prison, their body essentially belongs to the state. Right? The state dictates everything from food, access to medicine, what time people wake up, sleep, have access to everything. Your body is so controlled in prison and there's such a huge power imbalance between the people who run the prisons and the prisoners that the law has determined that somebody who is in prison cannot give consent, cannot give proper consent to a lot of things. Right. So it says you cannot. People in prison cannot be sterilized. This is not even an issue of if they give permission. No, you're not supposed to sterilize people. Well, they're in prison. The doctors knew this. The people running the prisons knew this. This is not a law that was hidden. And yet the doctors still performed sterilizations. And their excuse is some of these doctors were interviewed. Well, the nurse, the people working for these doctors were interviewed, and they said it was to save the state money. Right, that these women that were in prison were already costing the state money, and if they're having children, they're just going to cost the state even more money, and so that they were trying to save money by sterilizing these women. Some of the prison officials claimed that they didn't know that this was happening, except that over the course of the trial and hearings that California had on these sterilizations, it came out that all of those procedures were billed, right? The doctor bills the prison, the state of California paid for those sterilizations. And when the billing occurred, they marked it as a sterilization, right? So the doctor billed the prison for a sterilization. The people that work at the prison that are in charge of all the billing saw that it was a sterilization. And those kinds of payments have to be signed off by several prison officials, usually. And people were signing off on them. The documents were clearly marked as sterilizations, and prison officials were signing off, paying those bills. So it's very hard to believe that no one knew that this was happening. And also the women who experienced this talked about people knew. People knew they in fact wanted this to be happening. As a result of the work of prisoners and activists and lawyers, there was a new law passed in the early 2000s that absolutely, again, prohibits people from doctors in prisons from sterilizing anyone in prison. What's interesting to me is that those laws already existed. They were already in place. It just doesn't necessarily stop people from it. But the law is now doubly reinforced. There's a federal law and there's a state law now that prohibits sterilizing people in prison. In detention centers are kind of unique, in a unique legal place, because they operate a lot of times like prisons, except that they're not technically prisons legally, right? When somebody enters the country illegally, or there's a question of legality or anything, people are held in these detention centers, and these ICE detention centers. usually as they're waiting deportation, oftentimes people are given the option of, hey, if you agree to a deportation, then it'll happen quickly. It tends to happen quickly. But if the person being detained, being arrested, does not agree to the deportation, either because they can make their case for refugee, to attain refugee status, or because they're seeking asylum, or there's multiple other reasons why somebody, knows that they have a case to be allowed to remain in the United States, or sometimes it's just they have family here, and they don't want to go back to wherever they would be deported to, then they are held in detention centers. Right? Oftentimes, there are cases all over the country of people spending years in ICE detention centers. Right? So what's the point of creating those laws if those who were a part of the problem aren't faced with consequences? That's part of the issue. That's part of the issue because nobody has really faced any consequences from it. I mean, the doctors don't even lose their licenses to practice. So that's an excellent question, Christian. So in these detention centers, so they operate like prisons, holding people, right? People in limbo because they're not being allowed to remain in the US and they're not being deported. Right? Well, in 2020, there was a whistleblower that came forward from Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. So this is an ICE detention center in Georgia. And the nurse came forward and said that the doctor she was working for was performing sterilizations without their consent. So when women in the detention centers were going to this doctor, they were getting a tubal ligation without consenting to it. And so thanks to the whistleblower, we knew about this. There were also, at this detention center, it becomes very notorious for instances of sexual assault. There were people coming forward to expose sexual assault happening at the detention center. The sexual assault cases came from several, because you imagine who's sexually assaulting these immigrants. Well, the ICE agents, immigration agents, were some of the ones accused of it, but also some of the doctors and nurses who are in charge of providing medical care for these migrants. Part of the issue is that the Supreme Court ruled this. They started making these kinds of rulings in the 19th century. In the 1900s, the first cases the Supreme Court hears about the rights of immigrants were dealing with Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants suing the United States, suing the state of California and other states to claim rights, right? To say, hey, we have rights, we should not be treated this way. Well, what the Supreme Court has ruled in the 1800s and has remained consistent to the very present is that immigrants, because they don't have a legal status in the United States, are not protected by the US Constitution. And that's, in essence, saying that they have very limited rights. So while being held in detention centers legally, there are not a lot of avenues, not a lot of legal protections for these migrants, which opens the door for a lot of abuses to occur. Right? You already have a huge power imbalance in these detention centers, right? Where the people being held are treated like prisoners, and where the agents, the people running these detention centers, have a lot of power. A lot of times it's the power of life and death. People sometimes will get deported and they know that they are targets for violence and to be killed in their home countries. And to be deported means that they're going to die. So that puts them that huge disadvantage, a huge power imbalance with the people who run the detention centers, who get to decide whether someone's going to be deported immediately, whether they're not going to be deported at all, or whether the deportation will be delayed. Right. So it's a huge power imbalance. And whenever you see this kind of huge power imbalance, there are oftentimes you will always see the power being abused. So this whistleblower came out in 2020, right? It got a lot of attention at the time because this was around the same time that family separations were happening on the border, so that children were being separated from their parents. And so there was attention given to that. But just a few weeks ago, Maria Hinojosa, who you're all reading, her company, Latino USA and Futuro Media, put together an investigation of a different detention center. This is the Stewart Detention Center, also in Georgia. Because after these allegations came out in 2020, the Irwin County Detention Center was actually shut down. Right? There were too many abuses, so they shut down that detention center. Well, where were they going to put all the people that were being held in that detention center already? Or new people that were being held in that were supposed to be held in that detention center? Well, they were moving people over to the Stewart Detention Center. And what this investigation has showed was that sexual assaults were increasing at this detention center. In large part because that Stewart Detention Center before 2020 only held men. They only held men. Now, though, there were a lot of women being transferred to that detention center. And so they were being added into the infrastructure of the detention center. So one of the things that were happening is they were seeing the doctors that already had contracts with that detention center were seeing these new patients, new female patients, whereas before they had only been seeing male patients. Well, what the investigation revealed is that one of the nurses was sexually assaulting the women that were being sent to him. There were some of these women that reported the sexual assault to the detention center authorities. And at first, nothing happened. That nurse continued to see patients from the detention center, and sexual assaults continued to occur. Finally, this year, the nurse was finally fired. They were no longer seeing patients from the detention center. But what the report also shows that the detention center they seem to have a larger sexual assault problem. That it's not just like the doctors and the nurses that they're being sent to, but people are experiencing sexual assault at the hands of the ICE agents, immigration agents. If you're interested in that more, I linked the recent podcast episode that discusses that information. You can see here, it literally just came out a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of people don't pay attention, right? A lot of people don't pay attention, and I don't blame people for not paying attention, because a lot of times we're overwhelmed with the information we receive, especially with negative information in the media that we receive. And I think my point of bringing it up is bringing it to your attention, but also connecting it to the history, right? When you look at things that are happening currently in the United States of these kinds of abuses, of forced sterilizations, of sexual assaults, there's a long history, a pattern of this happening, and of it being allowed to happen because not enough changes occur in the way that these issues are dealt with. Right? You shut down a hospital, you shut down one detention center, you pass a law. But as Christian was saying in the comments, but without consequences to these actions, people continue to do them. Right? And so when we talk about reproductive rights, this should be factored in as well. Right? Questions or comments? Have any of you heard about what's been happening in these detention centers? Like, I know some of you are much more involved in some of these issues, or are much more educated on some of these issues. So I know some of you had heard about this, but not a lot. Yeah. There are a couple of documentaries for anybody that's interested. The most famous documentary on the case of the Latina women in Los Angeles was called No Más Bebés, No More Babies. It's a documentary that goes into those sterilizations that they occurred. There's also Belly of the Beast is the documentary that follows the cases of the sterilizations of women in prison, in California prisons. Yes, I mean, in 2021, when there was a lot more activism, and because it was connected to people paying attention to Black Lives Matter and these issues, there tended to be a lot more attention to it. Yeah. Yeah. I agree, Christian. It's a hard, like that podcast, and I was listening to it. It's really hard because they interview the victims of the sexual assault, and they're sharing their experience. So it's very difficult to listen to. But for anybody that can handle it, I think it's the podcast is worth it. The traditional topics that we associate when we talk about reproductive rights are more contraception and abortion, right? And that is a factor when talking about, reproductive rights and people having the choice of how large their families are or when they're going to start families. Those have been really important turning points in the history of individuals and in political history. Right? The development of the birth control pill in the United States, we say, caused a sexual revolution. Right? And we say that it caused a sexual revolution because having the ability to completely separate sex from reproduction meant that sex doesn't just have to be about having children. Right? And before you had reliable birth control, sex always included the fear of pregnancy. Right? And so when you separate those two, right? When the access to reliable birth control allows sex to be about other things, then it can be an exploration of sexuality. It can be sex can be about other things other than just for reproduction, and it caused a cultural shift, right? I'll talk about later about how what people were actually doing, I'm not sure changed that much, but at least people talking about these things changed. People started talking more about sex and sexuality after the availability of the birth control pill. However, I'm going to skip the birth control. I'm going to go out of order in the interest of time, right? If I have time and if I run out of time, I'll come back to the issue of contraception on Tuesday, but I want to make sure and talk about the history of abortion because you're all writing your source analysis on it, and they're connected, right? And one of the problems in the United States after the availability of the birth control pill is that even though a lot of people started using the birth control pill in large numbers after it became available in 1960, but one of the problems in the U.S. was lack of information and lack of access, right? Because healthcare is not a right in this country because it's connected, access to healthcare is connected to employment, and a lot of people don't have insurance through their employer. That meant that for a lot of people, contraception was too expensive, too burdensome. On top of it, sex education in this country tends to be very lacking, right? I don't know about you all, but I know when I had sex education section in school, right? We go through at least two, maybe 3 units of sex ed when we go to public school. We have one in 5th grade. We have another one in 6th grade. And then we have several options to take like health classes, public health classes, right? I remember there was a health class in high school and maybe another one in middle school, but there were at least 2 clear units about like sex education, 5th and in 6th grade. And let me ask you, did any of you, when you had sex ed, those of you that had sex education, were you taught about different birth control options? Because what I remember from my sex ed classes is the only thing they talked about was condoms. Are they doing a better job now? Are they talking about more than just condoms? Okay, so they may be doing a better job because I'm like, now we have much more, there are much more options. It says, I had a question in general. If you think of or know if different cultures of individuals from the past or present have any roadblocks or any limitations for having children or prefer to have children, if they did have any limitations, do you think they are similar from past issues or are there newer issues? Yeah, we like I will talk about like the Catholic Church, for example. Right. And in countries that are more heavily connected to Catholicism, where there's a larger Catholic community, one of the things that happens is in the 60s, the Catholic Church comes out and prohibits the use of any medical contraception and abortion. So Catholics, if you are a practicing Catholic, you are not supposed to use any form of medical contraception. Really, the only contraception allowed for Catholics by the Catholic Church is pulling out and the rhythm method, which means kind of knowing when you're more likely and less likely to become pregnant, and avoiding sex when you're most likely to become pregnant. So the Catholic Church does prohibit any other method of birth control, and it prohibits abortion. That played a huge role in the 50s and 60s, the attitude of the Catholic Church. In the US, what has happened is that most Catholics ignore the Catholic Church on it. Yeah, some of you are chiming in. Yeah, right. Oh, okay. Those of you who went to private school, that's interesting. Abstinence only education. That's what I got. And fear, and a lot of fear mongering about STDs. Yeah, for Catholics, it is absolutely prohibited by the Catholic Church. But American Catholics tend to ignore the church on these things. Also, the situation is different in other countries. For example, in China, you had initially, after the Cultural Revolution, an attempt to prohibit abortion, but then the population was too big, so they were actually providing access to contraception and abortion. The Chinese government was providing access in order to limit the size of families. Right? And for a long time, China had a one-child policy only. So it is very different across countries and cultures. In terms of abortion in the United States, traditionally, there has been no federal law, no nationwide ban on abortion. Almost ever. There was a ban on contraception. For a period of time in the US, contraception was illegal. However, part of the problem with any law that tries to limit access to contraception or abortion is that they're very hard to enforce. Right? Before the modern era, indigenous communities in all over what is now the United States had methods of inducing abortions. typically using herbs and roots. And we know that a lot of those methods, because we can find the modern equivalent of those herbs and roots, would have been effective ways of ending pregnancies. So in general, before European arrival in the United States, indigenous communities were ending pregnancies. And it was not morally wrong in most of those communities, with some exceptions. Right? There are some indigenous communities where it was prohibited, but in most indigenous communities, abortions were common, not prohibited. When where European laws come to the US, right? As Europeans arrive in the US, they bring with them laws, and our legal system in the United States is based on English common law. Well, there was no law in English common law prohibiting abortion. And so initially in the US, there is no single law that prohibited abortion in the US. In fact, we know that they were occurring in the US, that abortions were occurring. Usually the people responsible, or the people that, the way to get access to an abortion was through midwives. Midwives traditionally dealt with anything dealing with childbirth and women's issues and just health issues in general. And so midwives often grew abortion-inducing herbs and plants in their backyards, in their herb gardens. They were growing the things needed to induce an abortion. So that was typically widely available as long as you had access to a midwife. So depending how rural you are, people had access to abortions. Hubert, that's a great question. I'll come back to it because that is a fantastic question. So the first laws in the United States that prohibit abortion start appearing in the 1820s and 1830s. Right? And they were not laws that specifically banned abortion. They were laws meant to control poisons. One of the issues that was happening in the early 1800s was that there were a lot of quacks out there who were trying to sell people cures. In fact, there were people that would go from town to town selling potions that were supposed to cure anything. Hey, you have a cold, take this. Oh, you have a fever, take this. Oh, you have tuberculosis, take this. And most of these things did nothing to you, but in worst case, snake oil salesmen. At worst, they were selling things that were actually poisoning people because people figured out a way to make money, right? To sell these things that were supposed to cure you. And oftentimes because people didn't have access to healthcare or a doctor nearby or couldn't afford it, then they were resorting to buying these things that not only did nothing, but were actually harmful. So in trying to control the sale of those things, there were different states that were passing poison control laws. And included in some of those things were abortifacients, things, usually drinks, created from herbs and roots that would induce an abortion. So that's how sometimes those abortion-inducing drugs get lumped into the category of poison control. And that's how some of them are first banned. The first laws specifically banning abortion are passed in the 1860s. So at the start of the Civil War, and after the Civil War is when you get this whole slew of laws from different states banning abortion. Let me show you the chart I have. So these are the states and the year in which they first banned abortion. So you see some of them were doing it earlier, right? Connecticut banned abortion in 1821, but then some states are not banning abortion until much later. North Carolina in 1881. Let's see what's Alaska in 1884. Well, some of them were not even states, right? So they're taking a while to ban. There are some states that never banned abortion, but you do get a movement, a slew of laws banning abortion around the time of the Civil War. Kind of around, just roughly around that time. Oh, it looks like the South Dakota might be one of the last states that had a ban on abortion that did it in 1899. Right. A lot of these laws were supported by doctors. Right. This movement to ban abortion was fueled by doctors. Right. Why? Why do you think doctors wanted to ban abortions? Any idea? These days, if you look at doctors' opinion on abortion laws, most doctors' organizations and medical associations in general are in favor of not banning abortion, right? They might not. One conservative views, yeah, some of these doctors might have religious views. Yep, that's exactly it. The other element is because most abortions, when somebody was seeking an abortion, they went to a midwife for an abortion. And one of the things that doctors were trying to do in the 1800s was stop people from going to midwives. Right? Most people went to a midwife or some sort of healer, unofficial healer for healthcare. And in the 1800s, they were trying to establish the profession of doctoring, right? And to really establish a profession that was going to be successful, they needed people to go to doctors and not go to healers or to midwives for their health care. And so it was actually an attempt at regulating the practice of medicine. They're trying to regulate who can administer healthcare, who's in charge of healthcare. And so doctors wanted to control all aspects of healthcare, and they wanted midwives to stop from, the midwives from practicing healthcare. One of the ways they thought they could do this was by banning abortions. They said that is one of the things that people rely on the midwives for. So let's ban them. Let's ban them, and a way of like trying to arrest and imprison midwives or getting them to stop practicing, period. Right. So it's really interesting because initially people didn't trust doctors. Right. One, because medicine in the 1800s was not super reliable. Right. There was just not a lot of techniques for curing people. Those techniques are still being developed. And so a lot of people did not trust doctors. They did trust midwives. Midwives and healers, regional healers, were oftentimes the people who cured someone when they were sick. So they were much more trusted by communities than doctors were. So as the field of medicine is developing, there is a kind of legal battle between professional doctors and midwives and healers. Now, throughout the 1800s and into the 20th century, one of the things that was emphasized was the dangers of an abortion, because abortions could be dangerous, right? Now, some of that view might be unfair, because successful abortions, when they occurred and they were not legally done, right? If an abortion is occurring illegally and it was successful, then chances are we're not going to hear about it, right? Because it's illegal, people are not going to be shouting about it. They're not even going to be writing about it or talking about it. So we actually don't have a ton of evidence of safe illegal abortions because they're not visible. We don't see them, right? When we did hear them, when people did hear about an illegal abortion, it was usually in the setting of something went wrong, right? When something went wrong in an abortion, then that's when authorities heard about it. Right. Sometimes it was because of a complication with the illegal abortion. If the abortion was not performed correctly, it could lead to hemorrhaging, so uncontrolled bleeding. So the person would have to go to a doctor then and for help, and the doctor would suspect an abortion occurred, and then they might call the authorities. That's how we hear about illegal abortions oftentimes, is the ones that are prosecuted, people that are arrested and prosecuted for the crime of abortion. Or when something really goes wrong. There was a case in 1923 of a boy in Boston discovering a suitcase floating on the river. He sees the suitcase and he was really into fishing, and so he fishes the suitcase out thinking that he's found a hidden treasure. Well, inside the suitcase was the mutilated body of a woman. It turns out that this woman had gone for an abortion. The abortion had gone wrong, and the person who had performed the abortion panicked. He panicked because this woman just died and they are in trouble. They're going to get arrested and put in jail. So they panic and they decide to chop the person up and throw the body parts in a suitcase on the river. Now, for the true crime people in class, that's extremely stupid, because you can't just throw body parts in a suitcase on the river and it doesn't, they're not going to sink to the bottom of the river. Anyways, the stupidity aside, these kinds of stories were used to, they usually got a lot of attention, right? Because it's a scary situation, and it fed the idea that abortions were very dangerous, right? And they're sensational. People want to read about these stories, right? Something about them just kind of attracts our attention when things go really that wrong. Interestingly, in the early 20th century, most people did not blame the women seeking abortions for the abortion. The public tended to look at the women who were looking for abortions in a very sympathetic light. They had this idea that these women were naive, so that they didn't know any better. Or maybe they were brainwashed by the person who got them pregnant. And so they actually tended to look at these women in much more sympathetic lights, and to think that they shouldn't be imprisoned. Instead, what people thought that the law should do was protect these women, protect them from the unlicensed quacks that were performing abortions. I said, no, we need to protect women. That's why a lot of people were in support of the abortion laws. The laws banning abortion was to protect women. In fact, in cases where there was a prosecution, right, a lot of courts didn't like punishing women. Most women that were found guilty of the crime of abortion served no jail time, or very little jail time. Courts tended to understand why women were seeking abortions and to sympathize with them. But also, enforcing anti-abortion laws has always been extremely difficult, right? Extremely difficult, in large part because even if there's hemorrhaging, which was a lot of the cases that end up in the courts were because of things like hemorrhaging or incomplete abortions. An abortion looks exactly the same as a miscarriage. Exactly the same, right? In fact, if somebody goes to a doctor can't really tell the difference, medically speaking, between a miscarriage and an abortion. Oftentimes, when they report people for the crime of an abortion, it's because there's something else. Sometimes the women will say that they had an abortion, or there was an attempt at an abortion, or there's other factors that will indicate to the nurses and the doctors that an abortion was likely, because medically there's not any difference between a miscarriage and an abortion. That's what makes them very difficult to prosecute, right? Unless you have other evidence. Like bleeding itself is not evidence that an abortion has occurred. And that's what occurs when an abortion or a miscarriage occurs. In the Southwest, in places like California, Texas, Nevada, New Mexico, the other big workaround for a lot of people looking for an abortion was to go to Mexico. That was actually quite common in California. Right. Now, Mexico did not legally allow abortions either at this time. So they were illegal in Mexico too, but there was a lot less regulation in places like Tijuana and in border towns. Right. So it was easier for American women to go to Mexico, cross the border into Tijuana, for example, and find a doctor who could perform an abortion. And then you're going to a doctor performing it, so it's less risky than going to some random person for it, right? So that we don't know how often this was occurring, but it was occurring often enough that American authorities were worried about it. Especially in like the 30s and 40s, you have campaigns in California to try to warn women about the dangers of going to Tijuana for an abortion. It didn't stop people from doing it. People continued to go because for a lot of these people, it was either have an abortion here and maybe not from a doctor. If you can't afford to get a doctor to do it, you go to somebody who you're not sure if they know what they're doing, and it's very risky. Or you can go to Mexico and be able to afford a doctor who will perform the abortion. If you have the means of traveling to Mexico, and it's cheaper, for a lot of people, it was it was the more trustworthy option. Right, so we actually don't have like a ton of women that were being punished. In California, they were trying to punish doctors for performing the abortions, even though they were illegal, because doctors could make a lot of money performing abortions when they were illegal in California. So before the 70s, there were plenty of doctors all over California who would perform an abortion. If you could pay, if you could afford it. Right? They were taking a legal risk. So oftentimes they were charging quite a bit of money for the abortion. And so California was at times, not always, kind of dependent on the mood of lawmakers and law enforcement. Sometimes they would try to crack down on the doctors performing the abortion. But it was very inconsistent, right? Enforcing the law, it was inconsistent and sometimes not even possible. There's also a lot of myths about who was and is getting an abortion. And this is one of those interesting things that doesn't change. It turns out when you look at the information we have for people earlier in the 20th century who are getting abortions, and you look at the the demographics and numbers today, they're very similar, right? The mental image most people had, and I think still have, about who gets an abortion is a single woman, right? It's a young girl who is seduced by a man who promises her that he's going to marry her, and he's just tricking her into having sex. And then when she gets pregnant, he disappears. That was the typical image most people had of the woman seeking an abortion. The reality, when you look at who was having abortions from the evidence we have, was that a majority of the people seeking abortions were women who were married. somewhere between the age of 25 and 45. So, in the 20th century, between the ages of 25 and 45, we're talking about adult women who are married. A majority of them also already had children. And that is still true today. The statistics are still true today. A majority of people who seek abortions are married. They're still between the ages of 25 and 45, and a majority of people seeking abortions today have already had at least one other child, oftentimes multiple children. Right. The other image people had is like of women going to this quack, right? Women going to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, and they're going to get this illegal abortion. The abortion's going to go wrong, and they're going to die because of a poorly done abortion. From the statistics we have of the 20th century, right before Roe v. Wade in the US, the numbers show that most deaths that were connected to an abortion were a result of self-induced abortions. So these were people doing an abortion on themselves. Those were the abortions that were most likely to experience complications and where law enforcement was more likely to get involved. Right? And I have this on here because I want to make clear, this is self-induced means that we're performing them themselves in very dangerous ways, as opposed to today. Today, if you follow kind of abortion activists or abortion law changes in the law more recently, you will see the phrase self-managed abortions a lot. Self-managed abortions are the most common way in which abortions occur in the US today, which is not a surgical procedure. Right? Most abortions in the US, so over 50% of abortions in the US today do not involve a medical procedure. It's taking medication. You take either one or two pills, mifepristone and misoprostol, or mife and miso for short is what they're nicknamed among medical professionals, and they're that is very different than the kinds of abortions in the before Roe v. Wade that were self-induced. Self-induced abortions often involved somebody inserting some sort of object inside themselves to cause the abortion. And that's where things could really go wrong, because if it's not done by a professional who knows what they're doing, you can hit things that lead to bleeding and death because you don't know what you're doing. So self-induced abortions, very dangerous, but very different than the self-managed abortions that occur today. So Roe v. Wade changed a lot of things in the US. In terms of the legality of it. Roe v. Wade made abortions legal in every state in the US, right? Very few people have ever read the decision in Roe v. Wade, and I'm not going to make you read it, but I want to point out that the Supreme Court at the time, so this is in 1973, I'm sorry, used history to make its decision, right? So in Section 6, for example, the majority decision said, it perhaps is not generally appreciated that the restrictive criminal abortion laws in effect in a majority of states today are of relatively recent vintage. If I'm translating this for you from this legal jargon to what they're saying here is, hey, abortion laws that prohibit abortion are pretty new. They haven't always been around. And that's true, right? History shows that, yeah, the abortion laws in the US were pretty recent. Then the court says those laws generally prescribing abortion or its attempt at any time during pregnancy, except when necessary to preserve the pregnant woman's life, are not of ancient or even common law origin. Instead, they derive from statutory changes effected for the most part in the later half of the 19th century. So they're saying the same thing there. Then the prohibitions on abortion are not present in common law, because they were not. English common law is where our part of where our legal system comes from, and there's nothing in common law that prohibits abortion. And they bring up ancient history, right? And this is really interesting because in one of these paragraphs in Roe v. Wade, they talk about ancient attitudes. The Supreme Court brings it up. They say, these are not capable of precise determination. We are told that at the time of the Persian Empire, abortifacients were known and that criminal abortions were severely punished. We are also told, however, that abortion was practiced in Greek times as well as in the Roman era. And this is really interesting when the courts go back and look at ancient history, and they're specifically looking at Greek and Roman history, right? And why Greek and Roman history? Why do you think anybody would be interested in how the Greeks and the Romans dealt with abortion? This can be our question for the day. Let's make this our question for the day. Why would anybody be interested in how the Greeks and the Romans dealt with abortion? Why would it matter what they did? Why would someone care what the Greeks and the Romans did? I can write it down. I want to see all your answers. Why would anybody care about what the Greeks and the Romans did when it came to abortion? You can tell me no one should care. If you think it sounds dumb that anybody would care what the Greeks and the Romans did, you can tell me that. Yeah, Sammy, you're on the right track with that answer. Kendrick. Okay, that's a good answer. Yeah, Jasmine. That's a good answer as well. Hint, Derek has hit the nail on the head as to why the Supreme Court cared. Why the Supreme Court in 1972 cared about the Greeks and the Roman. Derek has the answer. But give me your thoughts. I just want to hear your thoughts on why you think anybody cared about what the Greeks and the Romans did. Oh, Jen also has the answer there. Yeah, Angel, that's a good answer. But don't be afraid of giving me the wrong answer. I want all the answers, including all the wrong answers. Yeah, Jocelyn. That's a good one. Well, while the rest of you post your answers, those of you that have already posted your answers, would you care? Do you care what the Greeks and the Romans did when it comes to these topics? Why or why not? It is interesting sometimes, right? Why do in the US, why we're so obsessed with looking back at the Greeks and the Romans? Why aren't we interested in what the ancient Chinese did when on some of these things? right? Like, or the ancient Egyptians. We tend to look more towards the Greeks and the Romans than to other ancient civilizations. Right? Why don't we care how the Aztecs and the Mayans dealt with certain topics? But as a lot of you are saying in your comments, in the US, we like to connect ourselves in this historical political tradition of the Greeks and the Romans. And this is true in terms of trying to define the West, right? The way that Western Europe and the US sees itself, the way it has seen itself is as better than everybody else. And part of the way they have created a story about the West is connecting themselves, like the US and the Europeans connecting themselves to ancient cultures that they believe were the best. And so the US and the Europeans have drawn a connection, have tried to connect themselves back to the greatness of the Roman Empire and the political system, especially the democracy of the Athenians. Interestingly enough, it was only the Athenians that had democracy. It wasn't the rest of the Greeks. But we call them the Greeks, and we connect ourselves back to them and to the Romans. In reality, by the way, our modern democracy does not look like the kind of democracy the Athenians had. We went back and read a lot of the things that the Athenians were writing about political ideas and political thoughts, but there's not a direct like stepping stone from us back to the Greeks, or from the US and Western Europe back to the Greeks. In fact, the Greeks disappear from world history, right? The Athenians, this battle between the Athenians and some of the other Greek states like Sparta, and kind of some of the victories of the Spartans end up and what the Spartans do with it mean the end of the kind of glory days of the Greeks. Then the Romans rise, and the Romans come in, and they're not looking at the Greeks. There are connections, there are cultural connections between the Greeks and the Romans, but the Romans develop something new and different. And then the Roman Empire falls, and the connection between the Roman Empire and Europe is very loose. Just as an FYI. That idea of the West connected to the Greeks and the Romans is a total myth. But because this is not an ancient history class, we still look at them, though, because we see ourselves in the tradition of the Greeks and the Romans, right? Even if it's not 100% based on reality, it's still the story we tell, right? So does anybody know how the Greeks and the Romans viewed abortion? Was it legally allowed, or did they prohibit it? Does anybody know? See, I love April's responses because April, you always respond in some way or another. Okay, I can tell you, the Greeks and the Romans both allowed abortions. They both allowed it until the rise of Catholicism, in the Roman Empire. But the rise of Catholicism in the Roman Empire occurs pretty late in the Roman Empire. But the first kind of prohibitions of abortion in the Roman Empire occur because of Catholicism. But before that, abortions were 100% legal. In fact, it was legal to commit infanticide in Roman law if the pater familias, the male head of household, wanted to kill his infant, he legally had the right to do that. The Greeks also allowed avenues for legal abortions. They did debate. We have some of the Greek philosophers debated the issue of when a human gets the soul. And like people like Aristotle, for example, said before a human gets its soul, an abortion is completely allowed. after ensoulment, after you get your soul, then abortion should not occur. But they couldn't pinpoint when the body got a soul. Sometimes they said, like Aristotle sometimes said, is at the point of quickening, when the pregnant person can feel fetal movement, that's when the ensoulment occurred. Other philosophers said other times. So there was no set standard in Greek philosophy on whether abortion, on when abortion was allowed or not, but they generally allowed it as legal. So that's part of what the Supreme Court is getting at here, right? And basically what they're saying is that Greek and Roman law allowed abortions to occur. Period. In terms of the law, that's what the Supreme Court was interested in, right? Legally, what did the Greeks and the Romans did? And the Greeks and the Romans allowed abortions to occur. So that's not the only thing, right? They're looking at the American Constitution as well, but that is part of what they say informs the decision that they made in Roe v. Wade. So Roe v. Wade allows for legal abortions all over the US. Now, even after Roe v. Wade, right, there were limits put on, okay, if abortions are allowed, can we limit when they can occur? And states all over the US immediately after Roe v. Wade had been placing restrictions on abortion. So even though it makes it legal everywhere, the Roe v. Wade and the cases that occurred after Roe v. Wade allowed states to limit abortions without banning them. Right? As long as the state didn't completely ban abortions, they could restrict some abortions. Right? That's an important distinction with Roe v. Wade. In 2022, right, the Supreme Court revised the Roe v. Wade decision with the case Dobbs v. Jackson. So this is the most recent one, the one that I'm asking you to read for the week. And I'm going to help you out by pointing out several aspects here of what the Supreme Court said in Dobbs v. Jackson. One, it says the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. So the current Supreme Court says that there is no constitutional right to an abortion, right? They're saying that in Roe v. Wade, a part of the legal or the way that the court read the Constitution was that because of the right to privacy, that the Constitution guarantees a right to privacy, and so abortion fell under the umbrella of right to privacy. What the Supreme Court now says is that nope, abortion is not included in the umbrella of the right to privacy. But they also go to history, right? This is the interesting part for our class, right? Okay, what aspect of history is the current Supreme Court interested in? Well, what did they go to? What they go to is the 14th Amendment. We start with the 14th Amendment, so history and tradition. And they say that, nope, the 14th Amendment does not say anything about abortion, right? It says, until the later part of the 20th century, there was no support in American law for a constitutional right to obtain an abortion. So they're doing kind of the opposite analysis of what Roe v. Wade did. They're saying, actually, there's no protection for the right to an abortion until Roe v. Wade, until much more recent in American history, right? They're not looking at how recent prohibitions are. They're looking at how recent is it a legal protected right. They're saying, no, it's not until very recently that there are protections for the right to an abortion, right? It says, until a few years before Roe, no federal or state court had recognized such a right, nor had any scholarly treatise recognized such a right. Right? Indeed, abortion had long been a crime in every single state. At common law, abortion was criminal in at least some stages of the pregnancy and was regarded as unlawful and could have very serious consequences at all stages. This is a very different reading of the common law, right? Because English common law, they're saying, does allow for some instances in which abortions are not allowed. Whereas the Roe court said, no, common law does not prohibit abortions. What else does the Supreme Court said? American law followed common law until a wave of statutory restrictions in the 1800s expanded criminal liability for abortions. That's true. By the time of the 14th Amendment was adopted, 3/4 of the states had made abortion a crime at any stage of pregnancy. This consensus endured until the day Roe was decided. Roe either ignored or misstated this history, and Casey declined to consider Roe's faulty historical analysis. So this was the case after Roe v. Wade, Casey. So this Supreme Court's interpretation of the history is very different than the Roe court, right? So the question for us, we're looking at just how these two decisions handle the history. What I want to know in your answers is, what do you think of the way they handle this history? And it's okay to tell me, I don't know enough, Professor. I want to know more. And I'm not asking you all to be scholars of the history of abortion, right? I think part of what you might think about as you read those is how each court interprets the history or looks into the history for whatever they want to find. Right? And that's easy to do with history, regardless of what topic you're looking at, right? Regardless of what topic you are interested in history. It is people always ignore the history that doesn't fit their worldview. Right? And I'm wondering if you see that happening in the Dobbs decision specifically, but even in the Roe decision, do you see people selecting the history they want to select? Yeah, Jacqueline, the question was why would anybody be interested in Greek and Roman history of abortion? Yeah. So this isn't even about like religion, right? Because as somebody who has studied, this history, when it comes to religion, people that genuinely have a religious philosophy that includes the idea that abortion is murder, like, okay, if that's something you believe, then nobody's going to convince you of the opposite. And I feel like there's, all right, I'm not interested in changing anybody's opinion, right? What's interesting to me is, okay, but how has this been dealt with in different times by different people? Right? Because when you look at the history, abortion has always occurred. We have evidence of abortion in hunting while humans were hunting and gathering. Right? And different people in different parts of the world at different times dealt with it in such different ways. Right? But religion hasn't always even agreed on abortion, right? Because we have this idea that Christians are against abortion. Well, different Christian groups are actually very divided on the question of abortion. There are Christian churches that have no prohibition on abortion, no religious prohibition on abortion. right? We're like, aha, but the Catholics do. Yes, the Catholics do have it. But even the Catholics haven't agreed on the issue of abortion until the 1960s. It wasn't until the 1960s that the Catholic Church actually created a rule for all Catholics on the question of abortion. Early Catholic scholars didn't agree on whether abortion was allowed or not. The problem with that religious interpretation is that for Catholics, the word abortion never appears in the Bible. Never appears, right? So then for religious scholars, the issue of whether it's allowed or not is a matter of interpreting different passages of the Bible, right? For Jews, for example, when Jewish scholars looked at the Old Testament to them did not prohibit abortion. The key passages in the Old Testament, and for Jews, was the order that God says, like multiply, right? Multiply and populate the earth. The way Jewish scholars interpreted that was, okay, you're supposed to have children, but once you have children, then abortion is allowed. They didn't agree on how many children you were supposed to have once to make abortion allowable, but in Jewish tradition, abortions have always been allowed. Abortions are allowed for Jews. Catholics debated it. Yes, no. Couldn't come up with agreement until the Pope issued an edict on it in 1965, 65 or 67. Right. Other Christians, right, for Protestants, and this is why the Catholics are fun to examine, because the Catholics have a very strict religious hierarchy. There is somebody at the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. So it's easy to bring them into these discussions. For Protestants, it's much more difficult because Protestants don't have one centralized church. The Protestants are highly fractured, right? There's not one Protestant church, there's many Protestant churches, and every Protestant church has a different approach to the topic of like abortion and contraception. So it's there's a lot of gray area when talking even about religious approaches to the topic of abortion. If anybody's interested, but it's interesting, by the way each religion handles it is really interesting. For Muslims, there are some differences, but in general, there are instances in which abortion is allowed for Muslims, depending on the community. Sometimes it's not looked at favorably, but generally within Muslim communities, abortions are allowed. And we can look at world religions all over the world, and generally most religions allow abortion in some form or another. All right, I'll stop here. I won't go into the history of contraception, but I do want to talk about that at least a little bit before we have our discussion of just Hinojosa, because one of the most interesting questions when you look at the history of abortion and contraception is like, okay, how did people's lives change? Did people's lives significantly change after birth control and abortion was legal and available? Did people's lives change? Did society change in a significant way? Right. Okay, some of you already have I know some of you already like have an immediate answer. So I'm going to try to complicate it just a little bit for like 10 minutes next week, but I will stop the recording. Questions? What questions do you have?